Discover the power of Photoshop 4.0 with Photoshop Essentials. Digital artist and professional instructor Katrine Eisman takes you through a wide variety of tips, tricks, and special projects for creating amazing digital imagery. Learn setup procedures for maximum efficiency, selection techniques for precise layering, easy one-step color and density correction, color adjustments and effects with levels and curves, time-saving keyboard shortcuts, and incredible special effects. Invaluable creative tools for getting the most out of Photoshop 4.0. Photoshop Creative Compositing offers professional techniques for creating multidimensional digital imagery. Through step-by-step instruction, Katrine Eisman provides valuable insight to Photoshop's powerful layering capabilities. Master the use of channel and layer masks for seamless image blending. Learn selective matting techniques, clipping group applications, compositing techniques for maximum flexibility, advanced selection tools, and time-saving tips. A wide variety of techniques that will quickly and easily speed your work and add to your creative edge. Plugin Power 1 features the plugin capabilities of Lightwave 3D with Macroform, Particle Storm, and Wave Filter. NewTek's own Brad Peebler shows you how to quickly master the natural modeling qualities of Macroform's Rail tools and Productivity toolset. Learn to create complex organic models using simple spline shapes. Use precision scaling and alignment tools to speed your modeling productivity. With Particle Storm, learn how to create cascading water, roaring fire, and showers of sparks. See how to control density, gravity, collision, lifespan, and other characteristics to give your animation lifelike qualities with this incisive particle system package. Learn how to selectively apply filters to Lightwave imagery with Wave Filter. Colorize, posterize, blur, color filter effects, and more. Discover Wave Filter's unique mixing board interface that enables you to animate any of these effects over time. Master these powerful plugins with Plugin Power 1. Learn to quickly create light beams, variable density fog, dust, and smoke with Lightwave Steamer, the powerful pixel filter and particle displacement map plugin. This in-depth view of Steamer shows you how to master its powerful controls. Create ray-traced light beams. Add atmospheric simulation with variable density clouds and fog. Discover how to use Steamer with objects to create dust clouds, billowing steam, and animated smoke trails. Learn to master Steamer's attributes and settings for speed and efficiency. Organic modeling and animation takes you through essential steps for creating realistic creature animation. Learn powerful modeling techniques to quickly model your creature from a simple sketch. Digital artist David Lombardi demonstrates modeling techniques for optimum animations. Learn the capabilities of Puppet Master for natural body movement. Add facial expression using multiple morph targets, controlled with Lightwave's Morph Gizmo. Then create the walk sequence, incorporating Lightwave's inverse kinematics capabilities. Discover how to set up and combine these features for maximum effect and realism. All this and more, available now from Desktop Images.
Dear video professional, the elements of this videotape represent the work of creative professionals like yourself. Unauthorized duplication of this tape not only is a federal crime, but also contributes to the destruction of an industry that you helped create. Please do your part by not duplicating this videotape. Thank you.
A special note for Macintosh users. For any functions mentioned using the right mouse button, hold down the Apple key and click the mouse. Are you suffering from unwelcomed house guests? Are flies vomiting on your food? Finding roaches in your shoes? Then get new Bug Off. You try to get rid of them, but sprays don't work. Aerosols make you gag. Only Bug Off employs an exclusive miniaturized weapon system to seek out and eliminate household pests with surgical precision. Bug Off comes complete with sub-miniature projectile laser-assisted technology. that kills bugs on contact. No roach motels here. Pesky ants just can't hide from Bug-Off's maximized environment shielding system. And those annoying flies. They're just no match for Bug-Off's flying insect roaming eliminator. %50 stronger than sprays. So get Bug-Off today.
Hello, I'm Brad Peebler, and on this tape we're going to be covering surfacing and texturing inside of Lightwave 3D. We'll cover the entire surfacing process from creating surface names, assigning those surfaces to polygon groups in the modeler, to saving your objects with newly defined surface textures in the layout. We'll cover all the attributes that you can edit inside the layout, and we'll look at some interesting techniques for doing some things that aren't readily apparent with surfaces in Lightwave 3D. On this tape we're using a TDZ 2000, which is a Pentium 2 300 MHz with a Realism graphics card from Intergraph Computer Systems. Let's get started. Okay, let's start here by loading up a scene. And this is just a generic scene that I've got set up here with a 1 meter sphere that we'll be using as our texture object. And what I usually do when I'm working with my textures is I properly light my object first, because you really can't tell what your surface is going to look like unless you have good lighting on it. So let's just go to our top view here, and you can see that I've got just a standard 3-point lighting setup. A key, a fill, and a kicker light. These are just spotlights. And of course we cover lights in depth on the lights and camera tape. So let's go ahead and go back to our camera view here and make a quick render, and we'll see that our sphere here is just a default white surface color with some flat edged polygons. So to edit that surface, where we need to go? The tab labeled Surfaces. So we come into our Surfaces panel here, and you'll notice first off that I've got my current surface selected, and it is selected as the sphere. If I click on that pop-up, I can see there's also a cyc surface, which is my background, and there's a default surface, which actually has no polygons currently in the scene. Now you may be wondering, how did these surface names come to be? Well, that happens in the modeler. In the modeler, where we create our objects, is also where we want to assign surfaces. So if we start off with just a generic sphere here, you'll notice if I go into my Polygons, Transform, Surface menu, we can actually get the surface naming and some sort of generic surfacing attributes. So this is where we came in and typed in sphere, and then we just told it to apply. That means that all the polygons that are currently active, in this case all of them, have just been assigned the name sphere. If I wanted to create some surface groups, let's say for example I wanted a stripe right in the middle here, I can select these polygons, go back to Polygon tab, Surface, or the Q on the keyboard is my keyboard equivalent. So if I just want to hit Q here, it'll bring up that panel. And now I can just type in stripe, and let's call it blue stripe. Okay. Now if I hit apply, you'll notice that my blue stripe doesn't look blue at all. Okay. That's because the name of your surface has no bearing on the surface color or attributes. It's only a definition of which polygons are included in that group. So if I come back into my panel by hitting the Q key again on the keyboard, I can go to my blue stripe, and you'll notice the attributes here hadn't changed to blue because the computer doesn't know what blue is. I have to tell it by picking a color, going to the blue here, saying OK, and now I hit apply, and that gives you that little stripe in the middle because these polygons are called blue stripe, the rest of them are called sphere, and these are the only ones that I changed. Now here's an interesting thing you can do with the Surfaces panel in Modeler. If I go into Surfaces again by either clicking this or again the keyboard equivalent Q, let's go back to our sphere here, and let's change the sphere to a light blue. Okay, right about there, that'll work. Now, I don't have any polygons selected, which, as you know from the Essential Modelers tape, means that all the polygons are active. So anything I do here it's going to act on all of them. Well, that's not what I want. What I want to do is only change the polygons that are named sphere. So rather than hitting apply, if I hit change, it'll change just the polygons that use this surface name. So I hit change here, and you notice now those are the only ones that get affected. Again, if I come back into my surfaces panel, if I would have hit apply, you'll notice it applied it to the entire thing. I can undo that and get my surfaces back. Okay? There are some base parameters inside of Modeler for diffusion, specularity, glossiness. These are the same attributes that you'll find in Layout, just a smaller subset here in the Modeler. And we'll go over exactly what each one of these do when we go over to the Layouts panel. Okay, let's go ahead and hop back over to Layout here. We're going to delete this object because we want our default white sphere. And there we go. So once again, to edit the surface of this object, we come to the Surfaces panel. We make sure we have the appropriate surface name selected. And now we've got many different attributes here on screen that we can choose from. The first thing you want to get familiar with, actually, is this bar right over here, which is your render sample sphere. If I hit render here, it'll actually give me a sort of simulated render of my actual surface. Now, I know I've got a sphere in this scene here, and when I went and made a render, it rendered a sphere. Don't be confused. If I choose my psych, which is that big object in the background, and I hit render for that, you'll notice it also shows me a sphere. This is always going to be either a sphere or a cube, depending on my options. It has no bearing on what this object is out here. So for example, if I go to render options, I can choose cube and say OK, and now I get a cube. In this case, since our object is a sphere, we'd rather go with a sphere to use that. Now there's some other options here. For example, we have sample size. This is based in meters, or actually based on default units, depending on what you have set in layout. In this case, we're using metrics, so this would be meters. That means that this surface will approximate what the texture would look like if it were mapped onto a 1 meter sphere. So if you know that, for example, the surface that you're working on, let's say you're surfacing a human character and you're trying to texture just the hair. Well, you know the hair isn't really 1 meter big. It might only be 1/3 of a meter. So you'd set your sample size to 0.3 meters so that when you made your sample render spheres, it would more closely approximate what that's actually going to look like on screen. There's one other option here, which is the background pattern, and that just gives you a nice checkerboard pattern in behind the render sample sphere. This is very useful if you're trying to do some transparencies and need to see what's showing up behind the object. Okay, let's go ahead and set this back to the defaults. And now let's take a look at our surface attributes. The first two here, load and save, are very important. Load surface will actually bring you up a requester that has lots of different options. And these are all textures that are pre-created and included with Lightwave 3D. It's a really good way to quickly get used to the surfaces panel by just sort of loading some of these things up and making a render. And you can see some really cool surfaces. We've got, let's say we want some clouds. We can render that. So without even becoming at all familiar with the surfaces panel, you can actually load in some really cool pre-created surfaces. Another thing you can do with this, of course, is once you've gotten a little more familiar with the panel, is you can load some of these surfaces up and then sort of pick them apart. Use them as building blocks, where you go in and you say, okay, hey, that looks like an orange. You know, how is that created? You can go through each one of the attributes and sort of figure out exactly what we did to build those. There's also a default texture here, which brings me back to my default surface, which is exactly where I want to be. The next option is to save surface. And obviously, this is just going to save whatever parameters you've created here. So if you've created your own surface that you really like, you can actually save it, commit that to disk, and then load it back onto other surfaces later. So as you can see, loading and saving surfaces is a good way to create basically a library of surfaces that you can attach to any object. Now, it's important to remember that when I save a surface, it's just saving a file that contains the parameters to build that surface or surface attributes. It is not associating those surfaces to any object at all. So if I were to save out this scene right now, load it back up, there'd be my default surfaces back on my object, even though I've changed those surfaces. That's because the surface attributes have to be saved with the object file if you want the object to bring that back in. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. Okay, let's just go out to our layout here, and we'll see, first of all, that if we look at what surface I was working on, I was actually working on the psych surface. Let's go ahead and change to our sphere here, and we're going to load up that little P's surface, which is this little surface right here. I'm hitting the S key on my keyboard as my surface sample renders. So if I hit that again, you'll see it renders a sphere. This is always the most current render that you performed. So now you'll see that my sphere is turned green. If I hit F9 on the keyboard to render that, you see we have our textured sphere there. Now, if I save my scene, okay, we're just going to save the scene here, just overwrite that one, and now let's load it back up, and looky there, my sphere has gone back to white. That's because the scene does not contain information about the surface. The object file itself contains the surface data. So let's go back here, load that surface again, and this time what I have to do is go to my Objects panel and click on Save Object. Alright, this is going to bring up a requester. Now, if I save the object as its original name, I'm going to stomp on my original object surface attributes. In other words, if I save this as sphere, which is what it was named originally, that white flat sphere I had will be gone and replaced by this green bumpy sphere. So what I'm going to do is give it a new name. I'm going to call it sphere green bump. And let me put some underscores there. Alright. And now you'll see it's changed this name to sphere green bump. And now I can save the scene, and I'll save the scene as a new name. And we'll call it GB for green bump. Alright. Now, if I load my original scene back up, it will load my original sphere object, which has no surface attributes on it, just the default. If I load the surf stage green bumpy, it's going to load that other object that has that surface attached to it. It's a very important concept to remember. Anytime you change surface attributes, if you like what you've done, make sure you save the object from this panel right here, Save Object. Another thing I'll do a lot of times is when I'm working on surfaces, I might change the surfaces of a couple objects at the same time. For example, if I go in and change something about the cyc as well as the sphere, I'll just go into the Objects panel and quickly hit Save All Objects, and that'll update everything that I've done to the disk and commit those changes. Let's go ahead and replace our sphere object here with the original sphere. This is another quick way to work in layout. We can just update that. Or, of course, I can load my original scene to get back to where we were. Alright, back to the Surfaces panel, and let's talk about basic parameters. The first parameter we have for surfaces is called Surface Color. It's this big button right here. And this one's a pretty obvious editable attribute where if you click on it, it'll bring up your color requester. Now this particular requester you're seeing right now is the Windows system specific. If you're on a Mac, you'll get the Mac OS system specific. If you're on Unix, you'll get a different color picker with that operating system as well. Now you just can use your color picker here, and again, it's system specific, so pick your color and you say OK, and that assigns the color to your surface. If I make a surface sample again by hitting the S key, you can see that surface color here. There's another color picker you might want to use. If you hold down your Shift key on your keyboard and click on it, it brings up just straight RGB sliders. And this allows you to mix red, green, and blue color values very quickly. So if I want to mix red and blue together or red and green, you can get those combinations very quickly here as opposed to using the color wheel. It's just a personal preference. Gives you a nice option of picking the surface you want. And again, hit S on the keyboard for my sample sphere. Now another interesting point about these sample spheres is that they act as a copy and paste layer. So I can click on any one of these surfaces and it will reset my surface attributes to be this surface. So if I want to go back to this green bumpy, I click on it and it asks me if I want to copy the surface settings from this sample to the current surface. And I say yes, and you'll notice now my surface has gone to that green bumpy, and if I make a render again with the S key, you'll see it there. If I want to go back to my pink, you can do that. Go back to the blue, you can do that very quickly. And then again, if you want more than 5 into a buffer, what you'll do is just save the surface, and then you can load that surface off of disk. Same basic thing, but this just gives you a very quick buffer of 5 surfaces on screen at all times. Now another neat thing you can do with this is you can actually copy your textures from one surface to another. So let's say we like this green bumpy texture, but rather than having it on the sphere, we want it on the background of the cyc. So I change my surface to cyc, click on the texture I want, say OK, and now let's make a render, and you'll see I have that cool green bumpy texture on the cyc, and my sphere remains white. If we want to reset that back to white again, you click on the white sphere, tell it yes, and now you'll notice when we render, we're back to our default white. The next basic attribute is the luminosity. And let's just go ahead and go back to our sphere surface here. And luminosity allows an object to essentially self-illuminate. So if I drag this up to 100% and hit S to make a surface render, you can see it becomes 100% luminous. In other words, the texture or surface color, which is 200, 200, 200 white, becomes 100% here, regardless of the shading. Now this is actually a little brighter than the 200, 200, 200 white, and that's because I also have diffusion turned on. Let's just shut this all the way down, and now you'll see that this sphere here actually matches this exactly. And you'll see also that it's become very flat. If I make a render, you'll notice this looks like a flat disk on screen. That's because in order to see 3 dimensions, or that curvature, there needs to be some shading. Since this object is 100% luminous, or self-illuminating, it can't be shaded by the lights in a scene, so it becomes flat. This can actually be very useful for creating glows and other types of effects, and we'll cover how to create a glow or a light glow in a little bit when we cover some of the other surface parameters. But you can also use this in conjunction with other things. Let's say we want to set our diffusion back up to 100%, which gives us that shading, again back to our default here. If you just want to boost the color values a little bit, or the brightness, you can add a little bit of luminosity, and that just sort of brightens it up a little bit while retaining some of the shadowing. Let's go ahead and shut luminosity down, and let's explain what diffusion is exactly. Diffusion is the amount of light that bounces off of your surface. So when you're set to 100%, the most light that it'll bounce on any area, if the light is glancing off of it directly, will be 100% of that surface color. And from there it'll fall off depending on where the shading of the lights are occurring. But if you want to set it down some, you notice it gets darker and darker because it's bouncing less and less light. This type of setting, a low diffuse, would be useful for metals, rocks, cloth, that sort of thing. High diffuse would be more for wood or plastics. Because changing your diffuse values a little bit can sometimes make only a slight change, you may not think to change it on a surface-by-surface basis. But it's important to realize that the world is a very subtle place. And so small changes in the surfaces in a scene can actually make a big difference in the overall photorealism of the effect. So don't be afraid to adjust that diffusion level just a little bit or a lot for a given surface. And we'll take a look at some more drastic examples of how reducing diffusion way down can really make a big difference in a surface. Let's take a look now at specularity. Specularity will adjust what we call brightness of the specular hotspot. And to examine that, we want to go ahead and change our surface to a little darker here. It'll make it a little more readily apparent. And let's in fact just give it sort of a dark purple there. And what I'm going to do now is just turn my specularity all the way up to 100%. And you'll see this is what we refer to as a specular highlight. And right now you'll see it's very bright white in the center, and then it's got a little fall off to it. There's a couple parameters we can change to adjust that specular level. First of all, we can change just the specular level percentage. Say we want to reduce that down to 50%. And you'll notice now the specular highlight is essentially the same size, but the brightness in the middle has been reduced to 50% the original intensity of the one up here. This is 100%. This is only 50%. If we set it down to 25%, now we've got 100%, 50%, 25%. You can see how that's becoming more and more subtle. Let's turn that back up to 100%. And you'll notice that the spot here is relatively small. That's because of our glossiness setting. Glossiness will set your shininess value, if you will. So a lower glossiness level will be more of a matte finish, and a higher glossiness setting would be more of a very shiny, almost like a pool ball. Let's take a look here. We've got a number right now set at 64, but there's also a little pop-up here that has some defaults. There's a low, medium, high, and maximum. Let's take a look at those. If we go to low, you'll see we get a very washed out, spread out specular highlight. If we go to maximum to get the extremes here, you'll see you get a very tight highlight. Okay? And anything in between, if you want a medium, which is our 64 value, as we can see here in our glossiness panel, or high, which is 256. And again, you can input your own values. So let's say you maybe wanted 320. You just enter that in, and you'll get some varying degree of shininess there. Now this works in conjunction with specular level. So if we set this back down to low, We get that spread out highlight. That's a little, we like the way it spreads out, but it's a little too hot. Once again, we can just set this down a little bit. Hit S, and you notice now it's sort of becoming more of a matte finish, almost a metallic finish there. And you can change that however you like. Now, it's important to understand that when I set these values, I can set them numerically by clicking in the panel and typing in, or I can use my mini sliders to slide quickly from 0 to 100%. But it's important to note that we can actually have values that go outside that 100% range. By clicking in here, typing in a value, I can set a really hot specular highlight of 300% if you want to get that washed out specular blooming effect. Now there's another type of parameter here that works with specular level, and that is color highlights. You'll notice if I turn this off, there's no color highlights, or it actually becomes ghosted. If we crank this back up to 100%, or actually any percentage, this becomes selectable or highlighted. So if I turn this on, let's turn this back up to 100%, and make a render, you'll see that the highlight becomes kind of dim. That's because it's taking on the color of the surface color. With color highlights turned off, the specularity is actually going to take on the color of the light, in this case white. So right at the center of our hotspot here, it's going to be white, and then it's going to fall off to the edge. With color highlights turned on, the specular hotspot will take on the color of the surface right in the center there, and then fall off to the edge of the specular range. So we've covered several attributes now of a surface, from surface color, luminosity, which allows you to have the surface self-illuminate more or less, diffusion, which allows an object to bounce more or less light, specularity, which sets your specular hotspot, and glossiness, which sets the shininess value of a surface. The next thing to look at is reflectivity. Let's take a look here. And once again, we find ourselves with a mini slider. Let's go ahead and set our surface by clicking on it back to this nice purple shiny surface there. And reflectivity has a mini slider just like all the rest, and I can drag through here from 0 to 100%. Let's just go ahead and start with 100% reflectivity. And you notice when I turn that on, the reflection options become unghosted. Again, if this is down at 0, these are ghosted. And if you try and click on it, it'll actually tell you this option only applies when reflectivity is above 0%. So we know we need to set that up a little bit. And now we have our reflection options. If we click on reflection options, you'll see we get another panel that gives us a reflection type and a reflection image. First of all, in the type there are 4 options: backdrop only, ray tracing and backdrop, spherical reflection map, ray tracing and spherical map. With backdrop only, this will just tell it to reflect whatever image is in the backdrop of the scene. And Don covered that in the layout basics. On the effects panel, you can set a backdrop image. This will tell it to only reflect that backdrop image. If we set it to ray tracing and backdrop, this will actually take into account the backdrop image as well as ray tracing the environment that's inside that scene. The way ray tracing functions is that it actually takes the camera's position, looks through the camera, and traces rays out to each individual pixel that's going to be in your final image. And if that ray of light reflects off of a surface, casts a shadow from a surface, or refracts, it'll send that information back to the rendering engine, which allows you to get shadows, reflections, and refractions. Now it's important to understand that if you're going to use ray tracing, let's say we go ahead and set this to be ray tracing and backdrop, before it will actually be able to ray trace the reflections, I need to go to the render panel and activate trace reflections. You can see the checkbox here. There are 3 checkboxes: trace shadows, trace reflection, and trace refraction. This is selective ray tracing, so I can tell it to do any one of the 3 or all of them. And you can also set different surface parameters that will allow it to only take into account the surfaces that you flag. In this case, we only want reflection, so I'll just turn those other 2 off. And that will speed up our rendering speed, because tracing rays does take a long time. Let's go back to our surfaces panel here and take a look at the other 2 options. The next one is spherical reflection map, and this will allow you to take an image and essentially create a large sphere around the entire world that gets that image mapped onto it. Okay, you won't see the actual sphere map, but what you will see is that sphere reflecting on the surface of your object. Let's take a look at this example here. First of all, if we're going to use a spherical reflection map, we need to have a reflection image. It'll be mapped inside that virtual sphere. So if we click on this panel or this pop-up, you'll notice we have no images inside of Lightwave. So if we go to our images panel, go to load image, I'm going to go into the Images, Reflections, and we have a Fractal Reflections texture that's pretty useful for creating reflections on generic objects. So let's go back to our surfaces here, and we'll choose our reflection, Fractal Reflections. And before we do this, you'll notice that this is flat and faceted. So let's go ahead and make a render here. And you'll see when it renders, you get sort of a disco ball effect. Now it's important to notice, and it's kind of hard to see with the flat shaded, so let's go ahead and turn on our smoothing, surface smoothing, which we saw earlier in the Modeler Essentials tape. That's actually going to smooth out the surface. So now when I render it, you'll really see that fractal reflections reflected in that sphere. It's important to notice that the ground, the background, everything around this object is not reflecting in it because it's not tracing or reflecting its environment. It's only using a cheat to reflect that fractal noise, which makes it look like it has some reflectivity. Because we're using a sphere in this example and we're spherically image mapping it, it really doesn't look so much like reflections. It looks like it's just changed the surface color. But if we move that object around, then those reflections are going to move around on the object, creating a much more reflective looking surface. Let's go ahead and go back into our reflection options. And here we'll choose backdrop only. And we can go ahead and deselect our image because it's going to use whatever we have in the backdrop. Now, as we know, our backdrop is set up in Effects, Backdrop tab. Now right now, backdrop color is set as just a solid color and it's black. So if I make a render, you'll see that it really doesn't change the surface at all because it's just reflecting black. But if I change this surface, let's say we go ahead and go with a gradient backdrop, now we've got that gradient ramp from dark blue to light blue and then brown to light brown. If we render that, now you'll see that we're actually reflecting that gradient backdrop. Now the reason this doesn't work in this example is because in our scene here, we've actually got an environment that obscures the backdrop completely. So this is a good case where you wouldn't want to use backdrop as a reflection, but you can see it does give you a very chrome-looking surface. Then, of course, the next option is for backdrop and ray tracing. And in order to further exhibit the ray tracing example here, we're going to load up another object. And we've just got a little plant object here we're going to load up. And let's just move it right over here in our scene. And we'll go ahead and render that. And you'll see now it is in fact tracing the backdrop. It becomes a little more subtle because we're also tracing this cyc. You can see the division of the sky and ground sort of brightening and darkening the reflections. Then we've got our white cyc reflecting off the bottom, and you can see the plant actually reflecting in that sphere as well. So you can see with ray tracing turned on, it's going to take a little longer to render, but you get a more photorealistic look because you're actually going to see true reflections of other items in the scene. The next attribute we're going to look at in the Surfaces panel, let's just go back to our sphere here. We'll go back to our reflection objects, and we'll see that we have ray tracing and spherical map. So now we can turn our fractal reflections back on. So now not only is it going to reflect the environment, it's also going to be using the reflection map. Okay, so the perceptive viewer will notice you actually can't see the reflection in that, or the spherical image map in the reflection. Why is that? Well, that's because we have the cyc in our scene, we have this large background white object, and then we have the reflection map, which is a very large spherical reflection map around the outside of the world, but the cyc is obscuring that reflection map. So how can we fix that? Well, let's come back into our layout here, and again, this big cyc in the background here, as we can see from the top view, is very large, and it's actually all the way around the object. So all rays that are bouncing off that surface are actually calculating for this object. So we need to hide this object from the rays so that our larger spherical image map can get into that. So to do that, we'll go to our Objects panel, make sure we have the cyc selected, and there's an option right down here under Appearance Options tab called Unseen by Rays. Click on that, and now when I render it, the camera sees the cyc, but the rays ignore the cyc, but they still reflect the potted plant. Conversely, I could come in and tell the cyc to be seen by rays, but the plant to be unseen by rays, and now you'll see that it will reflect the cyc in the sphere, but the plant gets ignored. This is just to further the example of the selective ray tracing ability of our rendering engine here. What you can actually do is speed up your overall rendering of a scene. If you've got items way in the background that actually don't need to be reflected or shadowed or refracted, you can actually just turn off the rays for those particular items. There's another interesting attribute you can set when dealing with reflections and ray tracing. Let's go back to our camera. Let's say that we like the reflection of the plant, but we don't want to see the actual plant. We just want to see its reflection. I can go to Objects, turn off Unseen by Rays. So now if we make the render, we're back to our original where we have the plant in the shot and in the reflection. But what if I just want it in the reflection only? I come in here, tell it to be unseen by camera, and now the camera won't see it here, but the rays will trace it. So that's a cool way to make an interesting effect, or if you need an object to be reflective or to just show up as a hot spot or a gleam in another object, you can use it as a reflection object or even as a shadow object. You see here its leaves are still casting shadows because, again, the rays are tracing and seeing that object, but the camera is ignoring it. Just another way to use the selective ray tracing rendering engine. One of the great things about Lightwave's rendering engine is it tries to approximate the real world whenever possible. However, it'll also sort of cheat things to make it faster. So for example, in the case of ray tracing, if we have two mirrored objects, it'll actually bounce the light back and forth between those objects. Now if it tried to act just like the real world, it would just keep bouncing that light and your rendering times would just shoot through the roof. So what we have is what's called a ray recursion limit, which tells it to only bounce the light back and forth X number of times. Now, the default ray recursion limit is 16. That's set on the render panel. Let's take a look. If we go to the render panel here, we can see we have our ray recursion limit set at 16. Now, in order to see the effect of this, let's select our ball here, and I'm going to go ahead and clone the ball one time and move the clone right over here. Okay, that's going to give us the ability to have the reflections between the two spheres. I'm also going to turn off specularity so we can see just the reflections of the two objects. Let's go ahead and make the render here. And you'll see the sphere. You can see the sphere here, and then you see a smaller version, and then a smaller version, and then a smaller version. What you've actually got is 16 recursions where the light is bouncing back and forth 16 times. Now in this case, it still only took 5 seconds to render, and it gives us a nice realistic look. But in some cases, if we have lots of reflective items, it actually could take a lot longer to render, in which case you might want to turn down your ray recursion limit. Let's set that down to 3. And we'll make a rendering. And now what you'll see when it reflects here, it actually looks exactly the same, but we in fact saved 1 whole second, which isn't a big deal, but that's actually 20% of the rendering time from 5 seconds down to 4 seconds. So most likely you're not, or most cases you're not going to get a 20% savings, but you will get some savings in your render time, and in this case we haven't lost any quality. However, if we set this all the way down to 1, what you'll see is a blue sphere. And that's because the rays are tracing just the original object and not the reflections, because there's only one ray recursion. If we set that up to 2, you'll see the reflected sphere and then the blue sphere inside of it. Okay, so that's one of the reasons you always want to keep your recursion limit up a little higher so you don't see the original surfaced object in the reflection there, because it becomes a little bit unrealistic looking. Once again, if we turn that up to 3, 3 looks every bit as good as that 16 did, and it's going to give us a little savings in time. Typically, I actually almost always leave this at 16 because it doesn't add that much render time, but if you do have a scene where you need more than 16 recursion, you could also set it up. For example, if you wanted to do 2 mirrors glancing off each other and give you that sort of infinity look of those mirrors back into the depths, you could turn your ray recursion up as high as you like. Just be prepared for a hit in rendering speed. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at transparency settings. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and clear out our second sphere there. And let's move our plant to the background. We'll just put it right behind the object like this. And now the plant is obscured by the sphere. If we come to our surfaces here, let's turn off reflectivity. Turn our specularity back up so we can see we're back to our generic sort of shiny sphere there. And now let's turn transparency all the way up to 100%. Guess what's going to happen? Okay, there you go. Now you still see the sphere. Why is that? That's because there's still specularity. So we've got a transparent sphere, but the specularity is still going to show up. This is may not be readily apparent why this is a good thing, But let's think about making glass. If you're going to make glass, a glass is a completely transparent object, or nearly completely transparent, but you're still going to see those specular hotspots or shininess on the glass. So it's important to be able to see that specularity as well as the having the transparency at 100%. Now, if you want to dim down the specularity a little bit, remember, all we have to do is turn down our specular level, and now you'll have a sort of dimmed down specular highlight on that transparent sphere. Let's turn our specularity back up, and let's turn our transparency down to 50% so we can see what it looks like set to that. And you can see now we have our sphere at 50% transparent. Now, what you'll notice also is it seems like the sphere only has one face. In other words, the polygons in the front are the only ones you're seeing. You're not seeing the transparency from the ones on the back. If we want to see those, we need to turn on double-sided. Double-sided means that the polygons will have normals sticking out towards the camera and as well as facing away from the camera. So on the polygons on the back of the sphere, their normals face this way, which is away from the camera, which makes them invisible. Double-sided makes sure that they also face out the other direction so now the camera can see them. Let's take a look, and you'll see the polygons are rendered back to front, and now you can see it's a little thicker. You can actually see the second layer of polygons in this little ridge right here. This also becomes very useful if you're going to use refraction to actually cause distortion of the object behind it with ray tracing. Okay, let's go ahead and turn off our double-sided function there and look at some other attributes you can set with transparency. Now, let's set transparency back up to 100%, and again, let's just actually say it down to about 80% there if we want to do some sort of colored glass. And what you'll see is it starts to look a bit like glass, but glass actually has what we call opaque edges or harder edges around the side, because as the curvature of the glass increases towards the edges, the glass actually gets thicker because you're looking through that curve there. So in Lightwave, we have a function in the advanced options for edge transparency. And in this case, it's set to normal, which means if we go ahead and make a surface sample render, let's go ahead and put our background back on. Again, a good example for using that background. You can see that it's 50% transparency, or 80% transparent rather, throughout the entire object. From center to edge, it's 80% transparent. If we set the edge transparency to be opaque, when I make my render, you notice now the edges, the closer it gets to the edge, the more opaque that becomes, or darker. Okay? There's also a setting for edge threshold, so you can actually make this edge become less. Let's set that down to 0.5. And notice now we have the thin edge here, making it look like a thinner glass. Let's go ahead and take a look at this object rendered. And now you see we have this sort of purplish glass orb sitting on top of the potted plant. Okay, if we come back to our surface panel here, you can also see that we have an option for transparent edges. And let's set this back to 1 to its default and make a render. So what we have here now, with the advanced options, edge transparency set to transparent, the basic surface color or surface transparency is at 80%, and then the advanced edge transparency is telling the edges to be transparent. So it starts at 80% transparent here and ramps off to be completely transparent on the edge. It may be a little more apparent if we go back to our basic parameters, turn transparency all the way down, but we can still have, on our advanced options panel, transparent edges. Now you can see it's solid in the middle, falling off on the edge. And again, we can adjust our edge threshold, cut it in half, and now I have just sort of fuzzy edges around the outside of that object. Let's go ahead and set this back to opaque. Go to our basic parameters, set this back up to 80. And again, we've got this sort of approximation of glass. Now what you'll notice is the image behind, or the potted plant, is not distorted at all. In other words, the light is not refracting through that glass. If we looked at a real glass sphere like this, depending on what that material was created with, you might have a very drastic distortion, like the case of a crystal ball. A solid crystal ball would create a very major warping effect. If that orb were full of water, you'd have still some refraction and distortion, but it'd be to a lesser extent. If it were a very thin glass, you might get the effect here where it's not distorting at all. Or if it were a thicker edged glass, but hollow in the center, you'd have some distortion, but again, not as much as that actual crystal sphere. So how do we do that in Lightwave? Well, luckily, once again, we have a ray tracing engine here. So we go to our render panel, turn on trace refraction. So we turn that on, close the panel, go back to our surfaces panel, you'll see that we have a refractive index. When it's set to 1 here, just see when it traces out, 1 is approximately the refractive index of air, which does nothing at all. If we come in here and we set this up, let's just set it up slightly to 1.1. We make a render. Now you notice how it's actually distorting it, almost as if it were a lens. Okay? So 1.1 gives us a higher refractive index. If we want to set it up again higher than that, started going into that crystal ball range, you see now it's really refracting, in fact so much that it's flipping it upside down as if this were a solid sphere of glass. If you look into the Lightwave manual, under the index, you'll find a refractive index appendix, which actually has a list of true refractive indexes for different materials, such as leaded glass, crystal, water, oils, all types of different materials. It's very useful. You can just dial in that number exactly and know that the refraction you get in Lightwave will be physically accurate to that type of material. Okay, the next thing we want to look at, let's first of all turn our refractive index back down to 1. Or let's leave it about 1.2, so we've got some refraction there. But let's take a look at smoothing here. There's two attributes. There's actually smoothing on and off, and then there's the max smoothing angle. Well, first of all, if we just turn off smoothing and render that again, you should get a pretty neat effect here. So we've got a faceted, sort of chipped out sphere. You can see that each polygon shows up as a flat shade. If we turn on smoothing, once again we get our smooth shaded sphere. And the way that smoothing works here is it looks at each polygon. Okay, so if we've got the sphere, we've got two polygons that come together, and they sort of join together around the sphere. Well, each place there's two polygons, each polygon has a surface normal sticking up. If you take that surface normal and you expand it down to the center of the object, you basically get an angle. And as long as that angle that those two polygons share is inside or less than the maximum smoothing angle, those polygons will become smooth shaded across. Let's take a look at that. If we change our max smoothing angle down to, say, 10 degrees, and we render this again, you'll see these polygons here have angles or share angles that are larger than 10 degrees, and these up here, obviously theirs, are less than 10 degrees. So these become smooth, and these remain faceted. So that's the way your smoothing angle works. This is defaulted at 89.5, so that things like cubes or hard edges won't get smoothed over. Anything less than 90 degrees will get smoothed over. The next attribute, again, is double-sided, and we took a look at how that affected a transparent object, but it's sort of important to understand why double-siding is important as a shader attribute. By default in Modeler, polygons are always created with only one surface normal. There is a flag you can set in one of the options panel to make it create double-sided polygons all the time, but the reason you don't want to do that is double-sided polygons just adds more geometry to your scene, in which case the rendering time goes up. Let's take a look in Modeler here. And in Modeler, we're going to create a simple flat box. Okay, there we can see it. Now you'll notice if I flip this around, you can no longer see it. That's because it's a single-sided polygon. We can take a look at that by selecting the polygon, and you can see this dotted blue line that comes out here. This is actually the surface normal. And as long as that normal is facing the camera, the object is visible. As soon as it turns around, it's invisible. You'll notice we only have one polygon, so we have one surface normal. Now if I come back to my polygon menu here, I can actually flip that, and that just flips the normal the other direction. You notice it disappears. That's just because if we rotate it around, we can see it from the other side. So if you want an object to be visible from both sides, as I mentioned earlier, you might think to actually copy, flip, and paste it. So now when I select it, you'll see that I have actually two surface normals, and I can see it from both sides. However, I also now have two real polygons, which means that it's going to take more memory to save the object. It's going to take longer to render the file. It's just going to generally cost us more in overhead. So let's undo that back so we only have our one polygon, and take a look at how if we go to our Surfaces panel, Polygon, Surface, or the Q on the keyboard, we can just flag double-sided. If we apply double-sided, even though there's still only one normal, it's telling Lightwave to see that polygon from either side, front or back. One other thing you can use the double-sided flag for is if you're translating objects from other programs, sometimes they'll come in with their surface normals flipped. What you can do is you can just flag that particular surface with double-sided, and now, regardless of whether they're flipped or not, they'll always shade properly. Costs you a little bit in rendering time, but it's pretty trivial. It's a good way to fix those objects very quickly. Let's go ahead and head back into layout here and go back to our surfaces panel. We turn off our double-sided. Let's turn our transparency back down to 0. And let's add the function marked additive. And what additive will do, if we hit render here, it'll actually appear as if the sphere is transparent again. What we've actually done is take the sphere and blended it with the pixels behind it at a 50-50 ratio. So anywhere that sphere was purple, the pixel behind it was gray, you get a merge of 50-50 between those two. Same goes with the plant and the speck highlights, all that, the shadow, just sort of merges that together. The next function is sharp terminator. We turn off additive there, and we make a render here. This is more useful for planets, and what it's going to do, you can see here, the shadowing has gotten much darker right here, and also where there's a spotlight coming from this side, a spotlight coming from here, it creates the termination from where it's lit to where it gets shaded. It makes a sharper termination, hence the name Sharp Terminator. This is great for planets if you're trying to have it look like it's lit from space. You want a real sharp line there, and that's the line that basically goes from daylight to nighttime. Okay, the last thing we didn't look at when we were dealing with transparency was the color filter option. Again, you notice when transparency is off, color filter is deactivated. What this will allow me to do, let me just set my transparency back up a little bit. We're going to right around 80%. And let's reset my refractive index. And in fact, let's go to the render panel and disable reflection and refraction. Go back to our surfaces panel here. And you'll notice now with transparency at 81%, I can actually activate color filter. Actually, if I have this at any setting at all above 0, I'll be able to activate that. So if we activate color filter, it's similar to the way color highlights reacts with specular level in that it will create, the surface will be transparent, but it'll also be taking on the filter or the color of the surface, base level surface. So that transparency section now also takes on the surface color. Now this is more important if we are actually using ray traced lights. So let's go to our lights panel here and tell it to ray trace all of our lights instead of shadow mapping. And now let's tell it to ray trace shadows. And what we'll see here is now our shadow from that light, as it passes through the object, becomes purple. So the color filter allows the light, as it tracks through, to take on the surface color of the surface that it's tracking through. This is really useful if you've got any type of item that's actually got color and is transparent at the same time, such as stained glass or light traveling through water, or even just a colored drinking glass. So that when the light travels through and hits the surface, instead of just casting a dark shadow, it'll actually take on the surface characteristics of the object. Okay, let's go ahead and hit abort here. And before we move on to the texturing segment of this tape, I want to make a point again, which is if you like your surface that you've created and you've been working on it for a while, make sure to save your object. If you only learn one thing from this tape, let it be to save your objects. So we're going to go ahead and type in here, save this as purple glass. If I could type, there we go. And now we've got that object has been saved. I always rename my surfaces, or my object rather, if I'm going to save it with a new surface. So I've got copies of the original. So I might set up my, let's say I've got the sphere with purple glass, I save it as sphere purple glass. But I've still got my original sphere, which has that default surface on it, so I can always load that back up and create a new surface. Like maybe I want to go and create a strange lizard skin surface on that same object. So my geometry remains the same, but I've got several copies of it with different surface attributes. But remember, if you change your surfaces and you like it, save the object. And let's talk about texture mapping. Where do we do texture mapping? Well, we go to the surfaces panel here. And you know these little, or you notice these little subtle T's next to all these different parameters. T equals texture. And anywhere there's a T, I can click on it, and it brings up the texture panel. So this is where we actually do our texturing. There are two classes of textures inside of Lightwave 3D. There's image mapping, which uses flat two-dimensional images created from a scanner or a digitizer or in a paint program. And there are algorithmic or procedural textures, which are actually generated on the fly by Lightwave. Let's start by looking at texture mapping with images. The first type of texture map, you can see right here, your texture type. you can choose planar image map, cylindrical image map, spherical image map, cubic image map, or front projection image map. These are all your flat, two-dimensional projections that require an image to be loaded in. These down beneath are your algorithmics or your procedurals. Let's start with a planar image map. And to do that, obviously we need a texture image. So we're going to go back to our images panel here. And we're going to load image. And once again, we'll go to our logos directory. And we're going to load up the video toaster logo. And there you go. Okay, so we can see that very clearly what that image looks like. Let's go ahead and close the panel here. Since we're doing a planar image map, what we're going to want is something that's created with a flat plane instead of a sphere. So I'm going to go to my objects panel, and we're going to replace our sphere object with a flat box. If we come out to layout, so we have a flat box here, and what we want to do is take that logo that we loaded in and map it to fit this rectangular shape. So we go to surfaces panel. Next to surface color, again we have texture. Click on that. Our texture type is planar image map. Our texture image is the logo frame. And now what I need to do, the most important thing right now, is to pick an axis to map on. Okay? Now, if we come out here, actually see that we chose the z-axis to map onto. And essentially what we're doing with that axis is determining which way the paint is thrown onto the object. Since we are in a world here where z-axis goes along this way, projecting or throwing the paint onto the object in this direction causes the logo to map right onto that object. If we wanted to map it onto the sides of the object, let's change the object here, let's rotate it around a little bit. You can see right here, if we wanted to map it on this way, I would have mapped it on the x-axis. So if I go back to surfaces here, map it on the x-axis, what you'll see is it's now trying to squeeze it onto this edge of that box, but you notice how it streaks off on the side. That's because this is a 2D image map and it's planar. So the planar image map gets projected on the object here, and since this has the same surface name, it just keeps projecting it, effectively repeating whatever pixel is on the edge all the way down the side of that object. But again, the appropriate way to map this object is with the z-axis, and we can hit automatic sizing, which will make sure it stretches appropriately, and there we go, we've got it mapped on there. And you notice now wherever I move my object, my texture is seen as well. Now you notice the texture is visible. This is because we're using on our options panel, go to layout view tab, we have enable OpenGL textures. On the Macintosh you'll have quick draw 3D textures. On Windows and Unix you'll have OpenGL. If we just turn this off, you'll see the object without, but if we make a render, you'll see the image is actually there on the object. If we come back out, we turn on OpenGL, it just allows us to see that in real time as well. Let's go back to our surface panel and look at some other parameters that we can set on that texture mapping panel. The next thing we have here next to our texture image is a negative image, and that's just a way that we can pre-process the image so when it renders, it reverses the colors of the image. So if you want to do negative, you can do that very quickly. And then we've got some interesting controls down here. Again, we chose the texture axis, but the z-axis was appropriate because we're projecting the image along that axis. But then we've got texture size, texture center, fall off, and velocity. Texture size, since we used automatic sizing, got set to that object automatically, and you can see how it adjusted that appropriately. We can go in then after we do automatic sizing and manually adjust it. Let's say we wanted to flip the image on the x-axis across this way. What I can do is I can come into texture size and make that a -1. Now if I come back out, you'll see in fact my logo has been reversed. If we come back in and say texture size, let's say it's a +0.5 meter. If we come back out, what we'll see is that we've got the image has been stretched down and it's automatically trying to repeat. So we get the image at half its size from the center here, and then it repeats on both sides. Repeating is set right here where we have width and height repeat. Let's say we change our texture size down to half on Y as well, which will make it look like this. We've got half size, and so now it's repeated all the way around. If we go back to surfaces, again, if we want to turn off that repeating, you just deactivate it here, and then when we make our render, we see the image mapped on there, but at half its original size. If we come back out to layout, you can also see that it's trying to show you in OpenGL, but OpenGL can't always show you exactly what you're going to see in the mapping coordinates. It's going to do as best it can in the real-time view, and the rest what you're getting is an expansion of those pixels on the edges there. But, of course, the final rendered image looks perfect. Let's go back into surfaces. The texture panel, we'll turn on our repeat and height repeat again. Deactivating width repeat and height repeat is very useful if you want to create a decal or a stencil onto an object. For example, if you want to put the logo on the wing of an airplane, you can position that texture and then deactivate width and height repeat so you can scale that texture down, and it would just be positioned right on the edge of the wing, and you wouldn't have the texture all repeated all over that. Let's go ahead and take a look now at pixel blending. And what pixel blending will do is actually try and smooth out pixels as your object gets closer to the camera. Let's go ahead and go back and set our automatic sizing back on so it stretches our texture to fill the object. And if we move our camera in towards the object, you notice the closer we get, in OpenGL it becomes very apparent the resolution is low, the pixels start to break up. Now, of course, OpenGL, the texture resolution is set here, so I can turn that up a little bit, and you notice that cleans it up. But this image map, if we look at the images panel, is 752 by 480 pixels. So our camera resolution, if we're set to medium res, is 640 by 480. So that texture map is a little larger than the camera size. But if we move our camera in really close and zoom into a particular area, there's not as many pixels as there are in the final rendered image. So it has to double those pixels and size them up. So what pixel blending will do is try and smooth that out. Let's go ahead and now we've zoomed in here a little bit. Let's move in a little closer so we can see this edge right here. And we'll deactivate pixel blending and make our render. And you can see the pixels sort of breaking up here. Now, the image is anti-aliased pretty nicely, but it is starting to break up where you can see some edges, especially in this line here. If we go in and turn pixel blending on, what you'll see is it's trying to smooth that out by sort of blurring the image. And you notice that edge right here and right here really smoothed out substantially. So that's a nice thing about pixel blending. If you're ever going to be zooming into an image so that the image will actually end up being larger than it was originally, you'll want to have pixel blending turned on. Now, sort of the converse of that is texture anti-aliasing, which actually tries to anti-alias the texture wherever it is on the screen, especially as the object gets further away from the camera. Because when you start to compress it down, what happens is now this final rendered image will be much smaller than it was originally, so it has to compress it, and anti-aliasing will help to smooth that out. You'll notice here if we render out, it actually looks a little bit fuzzy or blurry. That's because texture anti-aliasing is sort of blurring it out so you don't get any rough edges from the compression. If we turn that off, you'll notice when we render here, it looks a little more crisp, but now because of the compression, you're starting to see that anti-aliasing, or that aliasing effect rather, and that's a little more objectionable. That texture anti-aliasing really helped out. Now, another thing you can do with texture anti-aliasing that many people aren't aware of is I can turn this up and use it as an effect for blurring the image. So you can over anti-alias, which causes the blurring effect. So if you just want to blur out a texture, you can do that right there in the panel. Okay, let's set this back down to 1. And that covers our pixel blending and anti-aliasing. I usually leave both of these on. Some people won't because they feel like it blurs their images too much, but it's really mostly a personal preference. Now, we've been talking about adjusting the size. Let's talk about the center. We can also set that numerically here. And again, these are based on the units that are set in Lightwave. Right now it's metric, so we get meters. The texture center, if we want to change the center of this texture, we know that the grid size, again, is 50 centimeters. Once again, we're using that grid. It's a very important component in Lightwave. If we want to move the texture over to the edge, we know that the edge is approximately ½ meter over. So if I say texture center, let's move it over 1/2 meter. Then we come back out, and now you see the center of the logo has been moved from the center of the object over to the exact edge. And again, it's repeating, so that repeats it over to the other side. If you want to move it up on the y-axis, once again, go in 0.5, and that'll be moved over and up ½ meter. So that's how we can adjust these things numerically. The next thing to look at is texture fall off. Let's go ahead and automatic size it, set it back to the original position. And texture fall off will actually create a percent per unit that it's actually going to fall off or dissolve out. So right now we know that this object, by looking at the grid here, is 1 meter by 1 meter. So if we want the texture to be completely opaque here, we want it to have fallen off by the time it reaches the edge, which is half a meter, we would set that to 200%. We come in here, we say texture fall off, 200% X, 200% Y. Let's just set it on the Y for now so we can see it going up and down. And you notice in OpenGL, again, OpenGL can't show the texture fall off, so we have to make a render. And now you see, right here it's opaque, and as it hits the edge, it's become completely transparent, revealing the background texture color. If we come back in here, let's change our surface color to be dark blue, render it again, and it becomes more apparent that it's in fact dissolving or falling off to that background surface color. Again, we can also set a fall off on the x-axis, and we make our render. Now it both falls off on y and the x-axis, leaving me with 100% here, opacity, and then falling off to 0% because of that fall off percentage. Okay, so right now we've been doing everything numerically. Let's go ahead and reset our fall off here to 0. What if we want to do things graphically? We don't want to actually, we have to come in here and set a texture size to actually just position a texture. Well, we can do a thing that's called add reference object. That's right here. But add reference object, you see it tells me that the texture reference object is now called ref obj, or reference object. If I come out to my main screen here and I go to edit objects, you'll see that I now have, not only do I have my flat object, I also have a reference object. And that reference object is essentially a null object that was talked about in the layout essentials tape. And if I move that null object up, it moves the texture up. And there you can see is my null object. Just move it around here, and you can see as I move the null, it moves the texture through the object. So if you want to create the texture center very quickly and graphically, you can just come in here and drag it up, position it wherever you want. You can also rotate this texture. So if I want to rotate it, it's going to rotate right around that null object. And you can see as I'm rotating on bank, it rotates it this way. I can rotate also on heading, which will stretch it and sort of distort it, or on pitch. So that gives you complete control over your texture in real time in the layout. Let's go ahead and reset that. Now, because this is a null object, and objects can be keyframed, I can actually animate my texture over time by sliding my keyframe forward and just using standard keyframe techniques for that object, and the texture will follow automatically. So like that. Go to frame 40, move it down, and then let's go to frame 60, and you can also size your texture. And we'll just size it down like this. And now if I push play, you see as the null object animates, the texture animates as well. So a very quick and simple way to graphically animate, size, rotate, stretch, or position your textures. Using texture reference objects to animate textures is a great way to do it graphically. However, there are times when all you want is the texture just to move consistently throughout a scene. For instance, if you're creating water or clouds or fire, and you just need a texture to move through an object at a constant pace all the way during your animation, you don't have to deal with adding a null object or creating a reference object and animating it. You just want to set that texture in motion and let it go. In that case, we can use texture velocity. Let's go ahead and go back to our surfaces panel, and I'm going to deactivate the texture reference object and hit automatic sizing. Let's just make sure that our texture is now remapped perfectly. Very good. And in fact, let's go ahead and clear out our reference object out of the scene, so it's now gone. Now what I want to do is I want to have, without the reference object, since it's no longer there, I want this texture just to move up consistently throughout the scene, animated, moving up the object. So all I have to do is go into Surfaces, Texture, Texture Velocity, and now it asks me for a units per frame for each axis. Well, I want to be on the y-axis, I want it to go up, and we know that this object is 1 meter tall, so if I set it to 1 meter, that means the texture would go up 1 meter every frame, which would be way, way too much. So if I wanted to take, let's say we wanted to take 20 frames to go up that 1 meter, I'm going to set it to 0.05, because 0.05 times 20 is going to be 1 meter. And now we can see if I render a frame here, let's just go ahead and scroll through, you can see now if I push play, my texture is moving up at a pretty decent rate, and it'll just always move up regardless of how long the scene is. If I set this scene up to be 120 frames and push play, just keep scrolling. Irregardless of what happens in the scene, that texture is always going to be moving up the y-axis at that given velocity. Now that we've looked at all the parameters that you can edit for a planar image map, let's take a look at cylindrical image mapping. In order to use cylindrical image mapping, we should have the appropriate type of object, which would be a cylindrical type object. So let's just go to our Objects panel here, and we're going to replace the flat object with a spray can that we've seen in the bug off animation. And here's our spray can. Let's just reset our rotation there. And let's move our camera in a little bit onto the object. There we go. There's our spray can. Now what we need to do is actually have a texture that we want to map on this object. Now normally, as we were working earlier, let's just go to the can label here. Go to the Surfaces panel. Planar image map wouldn't really work here because with a planar image map, you're just projecting it onto a flat plane. Okay? We want something that's going to wrap itself around that cylindrical object. And since we want to wrap it around a cylinder, logically we'll choose cylindrical image map. Once again, we need to choose a texture image. And we can go with the toaster logo frame. And we're going to map it on the y-axis. And the reason for that is we have a cylinder like this. It's going up and down the y-axis. We want the map to wrap around it. Okay? And since the y-axis goes through the object this way, the map needs to wrap around it, around that y-axis. We'll hit automatic sizing, go out of the panel and take a look at the object, and we can see here it is with the texture wrapped around it appropriately. Let's go ahead and rotate that object around, and you can see how it wraps around the object. Now you notice a little seam here, and that's right here on the edge. This is just an OpenGL rendering error. Remember that OpenGL can't always render things completely accurately, and QuickDraw 3D on the Mac will have similar problems. But if we go ahead and render that, we'll see the final render has no error at all. So with cylindrical image mapping and spherical image mapping, you'll sometimes get a little seam. That's generally just an OpenGL render error. You can always do a quick F9 test render to make sure that everything's okay. You notice back here we've got the seam where the image meets. This is the left-hand side of the image meeting the right-hand side of the image on the back of the object. We can also go into our Surfaces panel here, and you can change the width wrap amount. So instead of having it just wrap one time, let's say we want it to wrap twice. So now essentially we've got a front logo and a back logo. And once again, you get the little render GL error there, but if we render it, we'll see that in fact it meets up perfectly. And now our image map is wrapped around there twice. Just rotate around the front here, giving us the front of the label and the back of the label appropriately. Now if we go back to our cylindrical image mapping panel, you see we also have a texture reference object here, just like we did for planar image mapping. So if we want to animate that texture with a null object, we can do that by simply adding the null, or adding a reference object, coming back out, and now with our reference object selected, we can rotate the map without actually rotating the object itself. We can also rotate on other axes. You notice because it's a cylindrical map, if I rotate on bank, you actually get some strange distortions. If I rotate on heading or pitch, you can rotate around that way as well. If we want to size that image, we can do that. And size with cylindrical image map is only going to work on one axis. In this case, it's working on the y-axis because the width wrap amount is set in the panel, numerically here. All the other parameters on this panel are all exactly like the ones we saw on the planar image mapping. We've got pixel blending, height repeat. Again, we don't need to have a width repeat amount because that's set up down here numerically. We've got the texture size and fall off, texture center and velocity, all just like we had with planar image mapping. One attribute we have on all types of image maps that we didn't cover with planar is world coordinates. And what world coordinates does is it changes our texture from being a sticky texture map, meaning let's just go ahead and go back here and turn off our reference object. Let's auto size it again. And you notice when I move the object or rotate the object, go to our spray can here, the texture stays with it. It's a sticky texture. It's stuck to that object, just like a label that's been stuck to it. That's because the coordinates for the map are based on the coordinates of this object, just almost like the map is parented to that object. If we go to the Surfaces panel and we set our coordinates to be world coordinates, that means it takes 0, 0, 0 of the world as its center position. Now if I move my can, you notice the texture stays put, but the can moves through the texture. Go back, apply, or deactivate world coordinates, and now the map is stuck to the can again. So as you can see, you have the choice of using a world coordinates map, which will allow the object to travel through the map, or deactivating world coordinates, which creates a sticky texture. The nice thing about sticky textures with Lightwave is that if you displace the points in an object with displacement mapping or with bones, the map will stick to it. So if we were to bend this can with some bones, the map would actually deform along with the object. Let's go ahead and take a look now at spherical image mapping. And to do that, we need a spherical object. So we're going to go ahead and replace our spray can with just our generic sphere here. And let's go to our Surfaces panel and turn on smoothing to begin with. And we see there's our sphere. We're going to move our camera back a little bit and up. And now we're going to take that same image we have here, the toaster logo frame, and we're going to go to the surface color, texture. And again, you don't want planar. That's for flat objects. Cylindrical for cylinder objects. Spherical for balls and spheroid objects. Let's go ahead and choose texture image, toaster logo frame. And we're going to go on the y-axis. Again, this means with our sphere sitting in the scene like this, it's going to wrap around this axis. It's going to map that texture around the y like this. Let's go ahead and say OK here, use texture. And you'll see here it is. We can rotate our object back around. So you can see the front of the object, and you'll see, since this is the front of the logo, it is in fact wrapping it around the y-axis. If we go to our top view here and we zoom in a little bit, you can see how the logo is sort of stretched around the y-axis of the object. And if we let's just boost up our ambient intensity here so we can see the back of that as well. You can actually see where the seam comes in, so it's actually stretching that image around that y-axis. Again, we have that little OpenGL rendering glitch here. Not to worry, that won't show up in the final rendered image. Let's go ahead and leave this view here and change our texture axis to the z-axis. And what you'll see now is it's mapping it around this axis here, the z-axis. So now the top is up, or the front of the logo is on the top. We go to our front view here. You can see that here's the back of the seam, and you can see how it's actually wrapped around that z-axis. If we then go back into our Surfaces panel, change that to be the x-axis, and then we'll want to go to our side view. Now you can see the side view, it is in fact wrapped around the x-axis. Let's go up to the top here. You can see this is the x-axis, and it's wrapped around it. But in this case, once again, z-axis, or y-axis rather, was the appropriate axis to go with. And let's turn down our ambient lighting again. Great. And go back to the camera view. And we can see that, in fact, this spherical image map is also a sticky texture. So as we change the rotation or the size of our object, the map goes ahead and sticks with it. Now, if your machine starts to bog down a little bit when you're using texture mapping, which again, we showed you can change your texture resolution here in the Options, Layout tab, Layout View tab, and by default it's at 128 by 128. It makes a chunkier looking texture, but you'll notice now I can actually move that quite a bit more quickly. And slower machines without OpenGL acceleration, you'll really want to turn that down, or even turn your texture images off for OpenGL or QuickDraw 3D. Okay, going back into our spherical image map options. Again, we have all the same parameters that we did in the planar image mapping for texture fall-off, center, velocity, reference objects if we want to animate the texture with a null. But we've also got the width wrap amount, as we did with cylindrical, as well as a height wrap amount since we're doing spherical. So we can go in here and set 2 by 2. Now if we come back out, you'll see we actually have the object is mapped with a 2 by 2 grid of that texture. If we render that out, you can see the texture here, and then on the back side you'd also have 2 back there as well. That's one of the nice things about the image mapping techniques, is that they all share some common core functionality. So when you open up one of those panels, it's a little daunting at first. You think there's all these buttons, and then each time you click a new mapping type, there's a bunch of more buttons. But remember, a lot of those buttons are the same from texture type to texture type to texture type. So once you've got them for the first one, you can forget about learning those ever again because you know them. There's a few different parameters on each panel, but the number of parameters that are different are fairly trivial, so it's easy to learn. Let's go ahead now and take a look at cubic image mapping. And for cubic image mapping, guess what kind of object we need? We need a cube. So we're going to replace our spherical object here with our box. Okay, here we go. We've just got a 1 meter box, a real simple object. And we're going to go up to our surfaces panel here. And once again, surface color, texture. It's not planar, it's not cylindrical, it's not spherical, it's cubic. Before we show you cubic mapping, let me show you why cubic mapping is important. You might think immediately that you could just use planar image mapping since it's a flat surface. Let's take a look at how that works. I'm going to come out here and assign the toaster logo frame to the z-axis, tell it to automatically size. And what you'll see now is that the map, if we rotate this around, is perfect on this axis, okay? Because it's mapping exactly the way it should on this face, because it's projecting it right into the z-axis. But if we rotate this around a little bit, you'll notice how the map falls apart on the side, and then on the back side, it's actually reversed. Okay, that's because the image is being projected straight through the object. So this pixel, or this R right here, gets projected right over to this side on the back, and we rotate it around, you can see, in fact, there it is. Okay, instead of flipping it around, it's just projecting it straight through. Also, if we rotate this around on its pitch so we can see the top of the object, you can see that it's just repeating the texture all the way back. All right, it's not mapping this logo face on that polygon. It's because all these faces share the same surface name, so when it projects this image on the z-axis, it just stretches that along that face. So this is a case, if we want the same image on all faces of the object, this is a good case for cubic mapping. Come in here, we say cubic map, again with the logo frame, automatic sizing. Now we come back out, and what we find is that OpenGL can't duplicate a cubic map. So in order to see that, we make a quick render. And now you'll see the image, instead of repeating along the sides, has been just duplicated and mapped appropriately for each of the flat planes on this cube. Now you might actually want to have a cube that has different textures on each side of the object. So what you would need to do for that is actually have a cube that has each polygon named a different surface name, and then you would map it appropriately. So if you had a box with the front called front, you'd use a z-axis map for that polygon. Then you have the top polygon named top, and you'd do a y-axis planar map for that polygon. So you'd have to map each side of that object independently of the others. But it's a good way to actually create a cube or an object shaped similar to a cube with multiple surfaces mapped appropriately using planar mapping. Okay, there's one other thing we want to talk about in the image mapping section, which is the alpha channel for an image. And again, this is available on all different types of mapping types, from planar all the way down. There's always this alpha map here. What that allows us to do is choose another image in this pop-up. They'll be creating a mask, basically, to obscure and reveal certain portions of this image. Let's go ahead and load up a different image here. In our logos directory, we've got a logo alpha. Here we can see what we've got is the center portion of this logo. We traced it out in a paint program in black and white, so it just reveals that much of it. So what will happen now, if I go to my surfaces panel, I've got cubic mapping. For our alpha image, we'll choose that alpha image, and then when I render it, what you'll see is the center of the object gets cut out. Okay? It's using that alpha mask to cut away using that image. And if we look in here, you'll see that anything that was black, any pixel on that frame that was black, gets completely transparent. Everything that was white is completely opaque. If we want to reverse that, let's say all we want is this surface here left over, we hit negative image and render again, and now everywhere the object is gray, and now we've got this decal of color in the middle. Now we talked about creating decals earlier by simply sizing down the image, and that works great if you just want a decal that's the exact shape of the original image. But if you want something a little more custom like this, you can use an alpha matte to create that custom stencil which reveals your decal. Okay, let's come back in here and we're going to take a look at what we can do with some other types of images. Obviously, this image was custom tailored to work with this image here to reveal a certain area. We can also load other shapes or other types of images. Let's just hit replace image here. And we're going to back out. Let's go into our reflections directory. And we've got one called glare streaks. You see this gives us sort of a smattering of bars here. And since I replaced that, if we come back in here, it's already on that object. So if I hit F9, again you'll see it's revealing stripes of the original background surface through that alpha matte. Let's go ahead and change our actual surface color here to go to that blue again. And let's turn off negative alpha. And you see now how it's actually revealing stripes of our texture mapped cubic image map settings. The final type of image mapping we're going to look at is called front projection mapping, and it allows us to do some fairly sophisticated compositing. Let's take a look. We're going to go ahead and clear our scene out here, and what I want to do is have a three-dimensional element interacting with a two-dimensional image. So let's come out here and load up an image, and what we're going to do is we're going to take this little shoe image here. You see a couple shoes sitting on the rail, and we're going to put those in the background. That's Effects, the Compositing tab, choose it in the background image, and there we can see it. And if we go to our camera view here, we want to see that image in the backdrop. So we'll go under Options, Layout Background, Background Image. That's on the Layout View tab. If we come in here, we can see that image now in color. Now what we want to do is we want to put a character inside the shoe. And I've got a little roach character here, and he's actually made up of several different objects parented together. So we're going to do a load from scene, and we're going to bring in our little roach here. We're going to also tell it to bring in his lights because the character was lit in the scene. So we'll say yes, continue, and here we have our little roach. And what we want to do is go to our roach body here, and let's just move it up. We want ultimately is this little roach guy to be sitting inside the shoe. So let's go ahead and move him forward some as well. And we want to sort of just peek up over the edge. Now what you'll see right now is he can't be inside the shoe because this is just a flat image behind the character. So what we need to do is create an object that's going to obscure the roach in the bottom half of this image. So we're going to go to our modeler, and once we're in modeler, what I want to do is bring in that background image into modeler so I can use it as a stencil to create an object that will obscure the roach in the right areas. So go to our backdrop here, and on the backdrop settings we have a place for different image maps to be on the different windows, X, Y, or Z. So I'm going to go ahead and change my Z image here. I'll go ahead and load one in. And of course we want that background image that we had before. We'll say OK. And now you'll notice I've got the image loaded in right here. And if I zoom in a little bit, you can see there are the shoes. Let's go ahead and change our window aspect there and zoom in a little bit. And what I want to do here is I'm actually going to create a flat plane, the shape just like this, so that our roach, when he's behind that flat plane, will be obscured by that object. So to do that, we're going to go to Objects. I'm going to start by making the rough box. And if I draw out the box here like this, and then scale it down a little bit, so that's our edging, create the box. And now I'm going to zoom in, and I'm hit that was my greater than key. Hit the G key, so that portion of the screen goes to center. And now what I want to do is make a sketch of a curve right here, or I can plot points, and I prefer to plot points. Now another thing I want to do, this is a little hard to see, I can adjust the contrast back in my display backdrop settings by turning up the contrast here like this. I'll say OK, and now that gives me a better feel for where that shoe line is. So I can go back to polygons, I've got create points turned on, and I'm just going to start laying down some points there. Point here, here. And I'm just using my right mouse key, so every time I click, it automatically makes a point. Okay, and I'm just going to go a little past that edge there, and we're going to go ahead and hit Control P, which makes a spline curve. And then I'm going to use my drag tool. Let's go ahead and drag this point right here past the range of that polygon, because I'm going to use this to cut that out, or just join that in so I've got one polygon here that's got that shape to it. So let's go ahead and zoom back out here. Okay. Now what I want to do is take this curve, copy it, and paste it in a different layer. Okay. In fact, we'll just cut it out of this layer here. Then we'll go back to this first layer, and I'm going to freeze the spline curve there. Hit freeze. Now that's created a solid polygon that I can then use to cut away. Let's go ahead and move it off axis a little bit here. So I'm going to drill it through my background object. Drill, we want to say tunnel on the z-axis, and that cut it right out. So now I've got this polygon. If we zoom in here, you can see the polygon shape is so that if I put something behind that, it'll match up with the shoe. So let's go ahead and save that to disk. Call it shoe mask. And go back over to layout and tell it to load that object. And we can see there's our object. Now we need to move it so it fits on that image. Now you can see, because I've got OpenGL on, it's kind of hard to see exactly where that's going to match up. So what I can do is go to my scene editor and just set that final object there, shoe mask, to only show up in polygon mode. So now I can move it forward, move it down, and as long as that curve matches the shoe right where the roach is, we'll be just fine. Over a little bit, up a little more, over to the right. Perfect. Now if we go to the top view, see by zooming out a little bit, that here's our flat plane, and our roach is actually behind that flat plane. So I've got quite a bit of distance. If I want to make the roach a little bigger, I can go back into my camera view, choose the roach body, and move it forward. Down. Let's go on the y-axis a little bit. Move them over a little on X. Okay. So now if I make a render, what you'll see is we've got our roach loaded in there, and he's in fact being obscured by that polygon, but this doesn't look good at all because we've still got our default white surface. So what we need now is for this image to show up exactly on this polygon. We come back out, go to Surfaces, choose the shoe mask polygon, go to Surface Color Texture, Front Projection Map, choose the image, come back out. Now the next thing we want to make sure we do is turn it to be 100% luminous so that it matches the background completely and no diffusion. That means that the pixel colors from this image will be 100% the way they should be with no effect of shading from the scene. And let's go ahead and make a render here. And you see it matches up. There's our shoe. And let's go ahead and turn on full-size render display so you can see that a little up close. And you see there's our three-dimensional roach inside the shoe there, poking up, laughing at us. Now, if we wanted to make this match a little better, we can adjust the lighting so the lighting of our roach matches exactly the lighting of the background scene. There's another trick we can do, because this is almost just a straight two-dimensional clip projection mapping. If we wanted to actually have a three-dimensional map, we can do that as well. There's a really great example on the Lightwave 3D CD-ROM. I'm going to go and take a look at that. Okay, so here we have our spray bottle Lightwave scene that came out of the tutorials directory. And you'll see we have some spray bottle here, and we've got a spray bottle down here. The spray bottle down there is actually going to pop his head up. And what we're looking for is to try and make these two bottles interact with this two-dimensional flat image. And I could do the same trick I did with the little roach in the shoe by creating a flat frisket. The problem, however, is that this little bottle, sort of sneaking around here, is actually hanging over the edge of the tub. Not to mention that this guy is sitting on top of the tub. Okay, so what we've got is a small object that roughly approximates the curve of that tub. Let's go into our modeler here. Let's get the object. We're going to get the object marked TubRen2, which actually, as you can see here, if we zoom in a little bit, is just a simple object that approximates the curvature of that bathtub edge. If we come back out into layout, you can see that tub right there is matched up to match the photograph. On the surfaces here, on the tub, we have front projection image map with that same image map mapped onto it. Now here's the tricky part. Instead of having the 0% or diffusion and 100% luminosity, we actually have some diffusion on this, and then it's just lit to match. Let's come back out, and that means when I hit render here, see it actually drawing in the polygons, and you'll notice that it's casting a shadow here, it's casting a shadow here. The other thing I might want to do is actually trace reflections, and in order to do that, all I have to do is go to my surfaces, change my tub reflectivity up to, let's say, 25%, activate trace reflections on the render panel, and make our render. And now you'll see that this bottle here is actually reflecting in the curvature of the tub, as well as this one, and we still also see their shadows. As you can see with front projection mapping, you can do everything from a simple two-dimensional composite to very sophisticated three-dimensional compositing, which allows you to have objects interacting with two-dimensional images with shadows, reflections, and refractions. Now there's one other technique we want to take a look at with image mapping, and that's image mapping and image sequence. So you actually get an animated texture on top of your object, which can be video footage, it can be something you've created in a paint program, it can be a 3D animation that you've rendered in Lightwave, and then you map back onto another object. Let's take a look here. Let's go ahead and load up our stock lighting scene here. And we're going to go and replace this sphere here with our little TV screen. And you may have seen this TV screen on our light scene. And what we've got here is a TV screen with an image sequence. You see here it says TV color sequence. That TV color sequence is just an animation. And if we go into replace with image here, you can see we've got our TV color image sequence. It's a 28 frame image loop. Now, these image sequences consist of a number of images that are sequentially numbered. So, for example, if we created that image sequence in Lightwave, when you render an animation in Lightwave, if you save it as individual images rather than an animation file, you'll end up with several files in the directory that you've chosen. So for frame 1, if your animation is called bug, frame 1 will be bug 001. Frame 2 will be bug 002. Frame 3, bug 003. On and on, just like that. Now, if we're loading an image sequence back in, when you load or render frame 1, it will actually load that image number 1 from that sequence. So in this case, we have our color TV image sequence. If I go ahead and scroll forward on my time slider here to maybe frame 16, it now has loaded TV 016 or TV 16 of my image sequence. And if this were video that I'd digitize into the computer, you'd have to split those frames out the same manner so that you've got a number of frames appropriately sequentially numbered in a single directory. So now that we have that image sequence loaded, we need to map it onto the object. So to do that, again, it's surface color. Since this screen is pretty much flat, we're going to use a planar image map, again, on the z-axis. And we just chose automatic sizing. And now that it's mapped on there, it'll actually play the animation when I render the frames. Let's go ahead and take a look at this scene rendered. So here you can see the TV screen on our site with our little logo next to it. And you notice that the video is actually running on that screen. So it looks like a little television monitor with some video snow and a little hum bar rolling up the screen. Okay, now that we've explored everything there is to know about image mapping techniques, let's take a look at algorithmic textures, or procedurals. So we're going to go ahead and load up our stock scene again here. And let's go ahead and replace the ball with our cube. So we can see how these are truly three-dimensional textures. We're going to go ahead and rotate this guy around a little bit. There we go. And we'll go into our surfaces panel. And again, for surface color, we go to texture. And we'll drag down beneath the image map types. And let's just start with checkerboard here. And checkerboard has a number of options. The first one we want to adjust is texture size. Since we know this is a 1 meter cube, we want the checkers to be smaller than that 1 meter. Let's just say we want 0.2, which will put 5 checkerboard grid across. And our texture color will be set to blue. And let's go ahead and make a render here. And what you'll see is, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Since we had it set to 0.2, 0.2 times 5 equals 1, or 1 meter, which stretches that texture all the way across. And since I chose the blue color, the texture checkers are blue, and then the surface revealed underneath is white. Now here's a good example of why this is a 3D texture, what it means to be a 3D texture. You notice, as opposed to an image map, it automatically wraps around the surface perfectly because it is in fact a three-dimensional texture as it's generated by the computer. Let's go ahead and take a look at some other options here. Let's go down to fractal noise, which is one of the more common algorithmics used. And this is great for adding dirt or just sort of changing or varying the texture of your object. Let's go ahead and change our texture color here to sort of a darker gray like this. And maybe get a little color to it. And go ahead and render that out. And you'll see we get this sort of dirtied up shading to the object. Some of it's fairly dark, some of it's kind of bright, but it's all sort of variant. It's just a fractal pattern essentially. And there's a number of things we can change about fractal noise. We can change the frequencies, which shows how many different patches are going to be created essentially. The contrast, if we set that way up here, what you'll see is the blending from texture to background color gets much sharper. Again, if we turn that really far up, let's just go up to say 15 and render it, you'll see very sharp edges along that pattern there. This would be good for creating like a cow texture. Or if you set this really far down, you get a very smooth, blended texture along your object. The other function you can set is small power, and small power sets sort of a random seeding inside the larger frequencies. So the larger this number is, we'll see in here, you actually get larger, the small pattern that appears inside the large groupings is a much larger sort of fractal pattern inside there. So if we set that smaller, you'll see the small power actually fades out, and with our low contrast there, it fades the texture pattern across the object. Again, if we look at this with our high contrast here, and a little higher small power, what you can see, we mentioned this is a 3D texture, and again you'll notice the texture actually wraps around the objects in three-dimensional space. Now one of the things that's kind of cool about this, if you wanted to animate this texture, if we animate it along the z-axis and pull it this way, and you'll see the texture sliding across here, but the fractal noise out here will actually change shape, sort of seem to almost bubble as it comes through the surface there. It'll sort of morph into different shapes. Let's go ahead and take a look at how that functions. And we're just going to set a texture velocity here. Let's just go with z of 0.1. And let's go ahead and render out an animation there. And we can see as the texture is sliding along the side of the object, it's actually causing it to change shape on the front. Most of the procedural textures are all just adding some color based on the texture parameters of that algorithmic. There are some at the end of this panel here. If we look at the screen, we'll see that there are three textures at the bottom: bump array, crust, and veins. And these actually change the shading of the surface as opposed to just changing the color. These 7 up here are just modifying the color channel. Let's go ahead and take a look at what I'm talking about here by choosing bump array and making a render. You see, if we have that test render there, we can see that this actually looks like little pitted grooves. Instead of just changing to little green dots, it actually looks like it's got some shading in there. If we change our bump strength, let's set it to a negative 0.8. Now, instead of being bumped in as they are now, it'll push it out. So it looks like they're sticking out at us. Okay, if we set that up even higher, maybe a negative 2, you can see it really starts to look like it's pumping out there. Also, if we change our radius, this is going to say that the radius, each one of these dots here, has a radius of 0.1 meters. We set that to be 0.08, and then the spacing says the spacing will be somewhere between 0 and 0.2 meters. Let's go ahead and set this down to be 0.08 exactly. And then we make the render, and you see now that gives me almost what looks like the texture on a basketball, those little pitted grooves, and we can reduce our bump strength there a little bit to smooth that out. Let's go ahead and look at an example here of what kind of surfaces we can create. Okay, so we can see here's an example of the fly head from the bug off animation, and you'll notice that the usage of bump array here works perfectly for the fly eyes, creating that little repeating texture of the little dots bumping out. Now what you'll notice is this is a color texture, but it still looks like it's actually bumping out. It's changing the shading of the actual object. But this is sort of a cheat. It's just tricking your eyes to make it look like the bumps are here. In fact, if you look at the edge-on view of the object, you'll notice there aren't any bumps sticking out. That's because it's just changing the shading. It's not actually bumping up the geometry or creating anything there. So if we got our camera right onto it, you'd find out that in fact that is flat, just changing the color to make it look like it's bumping out. But it's a very effective trick. Okay, so we've seen bump array. Let's take a look at crust. We go into our texture panel again for surface color. You'll see our pop-up, we go down to crust. And if we just go ahead and make a quick sample render, you'll see this is a pretty cool texture. What we've got here are some little edges that sort of ramp up to these little circular mounds. And what we have is a coverage value of 0.4, which means that each one of these little dots here is going to cover 0.4 of 1 unit. So if we set that up to say 0.8, you can see how actually the green dot spreads out over the range of the ledge. And that's because the ledge level is set at 0.5. If we set that back up to 0.9, you see the ledge level actually spreads out, and now the dots are back inside that range. Let's set these back down to a little more manageable level. And again, you see we get the coverage value of 0.4 and the ledge level of 0.5, so they're just outside. If we set that up higher, you'll see that the ledge level gets wider, but the little dots there stay the same. The next is the ledge width, which tells it how wide this width is as it comes down from the peak down to the ramping down. So if we set that up like this, you'll see you get a wider ramp down instead of this sort of sharp fall off. Sort of spreads down, gives a more rounded effect. And then the bump strength just sets up how high this is going to shoot up. So if we set that down to 0.1, it's a very subtle bump. If we set that up to say 0.8, you get that bump sticking up really high. So as you can see, this is an interesting texture for creating all kinds of organic effects like alien skins or a rash or skin irritation. So there's actually a surface loaded in with Lightwave called Disgusting, which takes advantage of the crust texture. Let's go ahead now and take a look at veins. And veins is very similar to crust, but instead of using dots, it actually creates sort of lines. And you can see here how those lines draw those veins. And again, it's got the same situation with the coverage level, ledge width, and bump strength. And again, if we change our bump strength, it's going to reduce the effect, how much it pops up. If we increase that, it's going to bring it out more. Let's just set our ledge level up substantially. And you can see how the white portion of the ledge actually expanded out. The coverage setting the green internal texture there. And you can actually create some really nice cobblestone and different textures with the veins texture. Again, bump array, crust, and veins are actually changing the shading of the object to make it appear as if that texture is popping up off the surface, when in reality, it's still a completely flat surface. There's some other methods for bumping out a surface, and that's called bump mapping. Let's take a look. We're going to go ahead and go back to our default surface here. And we've got our default white surface. We'll go ahead and turn on surface smoothing. And you'll see down here at the bottom, there's a label called bump map with a T. And this gives you the same image mapping functions, and it also gives you a few algorithmics. And what this is going to do is actually going to create a change in the shading of the object to make it look as if these textures are sort of popping out of the object. Before we set those, let's go ahead and change our surface color to blue and give a little bit of specularity so we can see a little more clearly. There we go. We'll crank our spec up a little bit. Great. Now if we were to load an image map, it's actually going to bump up the map that we load in. Wherever that map is white, will bump out. Wherever it's black, will sit down at zero level where the original surface was. So if you wanted to have like a logo sort of slightly embossed out of a surface, you'd make your logo in white with a background in black, and then the white areas would sort of pop out. If you're using an algorithmic texture, say for example crumple, if we make a render here, you'll see that it sort of models up the texture. It all makes it look like it's been sort of hammered out. We can change our texture amplitude. If we set that way up, you notice you can go above 100%, and it's really going to chip it out. Your number of scales, if we reduce that, it's just going to change the number of sort of times it's been hit with a hammer, if you will, or how many times it's been chipped. And let's set that back up to 4. And then the small power is going to adjust the pits inside there. So now we've got the sort of roughed out hammered effect, and then the small power inside is a small chipping away effect that we get. So the larger that is, the more it's going to dip in on the smaller chips. So crumple is an interesting bump map because it allows you to create a lot of things. You can use it for water, for sort of roughing up the surface of a water texture. You can use it for rocks, all types of interesting textures that way. There's also a ripples and a fractal bumps under bump map. The ripples obviously is going to create nice ripples for a water texture. The bump map fractal noise is actually going to create random bump patterns, similar to the fractal noise on the color pattern, except for rather than just changing the color of the surface, it's actually going to make it look like it's more or less bumped up. It's great for randomizing terrain, creating pitted surfaces for things like skin, if you set it at a small level. Also, the orange texture we saw earlier uses a fractal bump to sort of randomly pit in little sections of the surface. Let's take a look at where else we find textures on the surfaces panel. And you'll see that not only do we have a texture next to the surface color and bump mapping, but we also have it next to luminosity, diffusion, specularity, reflectivity, and transparency. Now what's going to happen with these textures is rather than, if you have, say, an image map, rather than taking the color of the image map and replacing the color of the actual surface, it's going to take the luminosity values of that texture map. So for example, if we have a black and white image, anywhere that the image is white, that surface will, or that attribute will be at 100% of the externally set value. So for example, if specularity is set to 100% and we have a black and white image loaded as a texture, anywhere that that image is white, the specularity value will be 100%. Anywhere that image is black, the specularity value will be 0%. Let's take a look at some rendered examples of how using texture maps in different channels of a surface makes the surface look much different. We're going to start off by showing you the actual reflection map image that we've loaded up out of the reflections directory. And here's that image map mapped onto the object in a color map. So you see it just maps it on exactly as a map would be. As a luminosity map, you remember the sphere was blue, so a luminosity map is making it where anywhere the image was bright becomes very bright luminous, anywhere it was dark becomes opaque. With a diffuse map, you see here it just does the same thing, adjusting how much light is bounced based on the light and dark values of the image map. The spec map, this only changes the specularity highlight of the object. So you can see the surface of the object actually stays at solid blue, but anywhere there's specularity, depending on whether the image is white or black, becomes darker or brighter in the specularity channel. On the reflection map side, anywhere the image is white becomes more reflective, and where it's black, it becomes less reflective. As a transparency map, where it's dark, it becomes less transparent, and where it's light, it becomes more transparent. And with bump map, you can see the darker areas stay flat, and the lighter areas protrude and stick up. So you can see by combining different texture map techniques on the different texture channels, you can really increase your ability to create photorealistic looking surfaces. Now we've been spending our time talking about photorealism quite a bit. How about doing stylized rendering? Well, Lightwave has a really cool feature called the cell shader, which allows us to take our 3D objects and render them out looking as if they've been two-dimensionally hand-drawn. Let's take a look at how that works. Go back into layout here, and we're going to go up and load up a scene here, which has our little cowboy in the scene. And you can see we've got a little cowboy here. Let's take a look at him rendered. We render him out. So you can see our little cowboy here rendered out. You got the nice smooth shading on the hat. You can see the skin. He's got the nice smooth shading here. You got a little texture on the pants. Some specularity on the gun barrel there. So this looks, I wouldn't say photoreal, looks kind of plasticky, but it certainly doesn't look like a cartoon render. So how do we adjust this guy to look like he's been hand-drawn? All we need to do is come over to our surfaces panel here. And on the surfaces panel, beyond the basic parameters, there are advanced options. And we've looked at some of these, but the ones we want to focus on right now are the shader plugins. And you see there are 4 spots for shader plugins, which means you can actually stack different shaders. And these here are included with Lightwave 5.5. The one we want to look at is the Super Cell Shader. But if you get extra plugins from third-party companies, if you buy shader plugins, this is where they'll show up. Okay, let's choose our Super Cell Shader here. That was for the cowboy belt buckle. And what I can do is just use my arrow key on the keyboard to scroll through the different textures and just activate the cell shader for each one of those textures. We'll go through here, and you'll notice there are 2 cell shaders listed. There's the AH cell shader and the Super Cell Shader. The AH cell shader is just sort of a standard cell shading mode that you can add to quickly adjust your surface to look like it's been cell shaded. The Super Cell Shader actually gives you parameters that you can adjust. You can actually adjust the zones in the way that it shades. Okay, should be Almost done here. There we go. And now you can see if I scroll through, I've got all my cowboy surfaces here have cell shader added. Let's go ahead and take a render now. Okay, now he's starting to look a little hand-drawn. As you can see here, we've got, instead of the smooth shading, it's broken up into zones, just like you would do if you were drawing a cartoon. Now what we don't have is the lines around the outside. In essence, we have the paint, but not the ink. So we need to do the inking of our ink and paint. So let's go ahead and come back out of our render here and go to Objects, Appearance Options tab, and down by Polygon Edges, when we activate Polygon Edges, we get Cell Look Edges that comes available. Now if we render that, now with this rendered, you can see not only do we have our steps in the zones here, but we also now have the black lines drawn around the outside of our character. And one of the cool things about Lightwave's polygon edges is it'll actually draw the contour lines on curves, not only outside edges, but it'll actually track out interior edges like these here, or the ones across the belt line or around the belt buckle, to really accentuate exactly how a cartoonist would draw those lines. Now that we've explored all the options for surfacing and texturing within Lightwave, you should hopefully be able to create surfaces from the very photoreal all the way down to the stylized cartoon look. If you're interested in expanding your knowledge even further, please take a look at the Advanced Modeling and Animation Techniques tapes in the Essential series. Until next time, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.